Happy Thursday. Happy Thursday. This is Jennifer Signieri with Johnson and Groniger, and this is Workers' Compensation Talk. This is Johnson and Groniger's weekly Facebook Live series where we talk about an area of workers' compensation law in hopefully a straightforward way that is useful to everyone. The format is the same, but the area of law or the area of workers' compensation law will change on a weekly basis. We'll talk about a given area of workers' comp law. Folks are welcome to post questions in the comments. I'll try to answer those questions live, or if you are seeing this episode after the fact, please feel free to post questions in the comment section and we'll answer them even after the broadcast. I am a board certified by the North Carolina State Bar as a workers' compensation specialist. And myself and my team at Johnson Groniger love answering questions, be it here or as part of a free consultation. Please like us on Facebook or YouTube. Share the info you might find here with folks you think might be interested. Tag them in the comment section so that they can see it and tune in on a weekly basis because we will be covering different areas of workers' comp law. Before I begin, I'll give the obligatory legal disclaimer. What we will be talking about today is general information about North Carolina workers' compensation law. It's not meant to be legal advice for a specific claim, but if you hear something that triggers a question, piques your interest, please do give us a call. We offer free consultations, and as you can see on the screen, we have our phone number posted at 919-240-4054. You can also feel free, if you don't want to give us a call, you can go on our website, which is also listed, and enter your information on the contact form, and we'll give you a call. So that's an option as well. So today's episode, we'll be talking about workers' compensation checks, the bane of everyone's existence. Your checks are always important when you're hurt, but when you're hurt, they are especially important. In the time of COVID also, I know it seems like all of us are really stretching our dollars. I know some of you probably had some delays in getting your checks over the holidays. It's something we see as a recurring issue. In part, that was probably due to the mail delays, but it's a consistent issue, TTD checks or TPD checks coming in late. So that said, we'll be covering three things today. First, we'll be covering what you are due. Then we'll be covering when you are due it. And then we will cover what you can do about your checks maybe being late. What are your options? So first, how much can you expect to get? So when you are eligible for a workers' compensation check, you might get it in the form of either a TTD or a TPD. So when you are completely written out of work by a workers' compensation doctor, and usually it's a workers' comp doctor, not a doctor that you see, you get something called temporary total disability, TTD for short. And typically, TTD is going to be 2/3 of your usual pay. Now, actually, more precisely, it's 66 2/3% of your average weekly wage. And that's mandated by the Workers' Compensation Act. So, sounds simple, but the amount of TTD you might get is oftentimes a point of contention. The 66 2/3% check compensation rate is based on your average weekly wage. And it is a lot more detailed than most folks realize. First, your average weekly wage is going to be determined by the 52 weeks gross wages for the year before you got hurt. So you'll look at maybe your last check before you got hurt and maybe look at the year-to-date gross wages and divide that depending on the number of weeks before you got hurt. That's sometimes a good indicator, but you might have to do a little bit more digging. You might have to ask the workers' compensation carrier for something called a Form 22, which usually will be your actual monthly gross wages for the 12 months before you got hurt. So you can take that amount, the gross wages for the year before you got hurt, divide that by 52, and that's your average weekly wage. After you have your average weekly wage, you can multiply that by 0.666, so 0.6667, which is 66 2/3%, and you can figure out your compensation rate. So it can be very confusing, but that is generally what you can expect is the amount on your workers' compensation check. So gross wages before taxes. What does it not include? It doesn't include things like health insurance or pay from a second job. And that's a big one. Sometimes we'll talk to folks who get hurt on the job, and then because of their injury, they can't work the second job that they had, maybe on nights. And yeah, the Workers' Compensation Act will not pay them for the fact that they've lost wages on the second job. It's an unfortunate reality of the Workers' Compensation Act, and it's not our rules, but that is something to be mindful of. If your average weekly wage and your comp rate is wrong, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem because so much of what happens in your workers' comp claim is going to be dependent on what your average weekly wage and comp rate are going to be. Not just your checks, but if you at some point go back to work and you get a compensation rate, a rating, that will also be based on your compensation rate. If you enter into settlement negotiations, it will likely be based on your compensation rate. So getting your average weekly wage and compensation rate correct from the get-go is really important. I've just given a really oversimplification of of how you can calculate your average weekly wage and your compensation rate. But determining average weekly wage and compensation rate can be difficult sometimes because there are a lot of exceptions. And there is hundreds and hundreds of cases that cover these exceptions. Folks who have maybe not worked for 52 weeks before they got hurt, or folks who are temporary or short-term workers. And I'm giving kind of this one of many other ways to calculate average weekly wage and compensation rate. If you do have maybe facts that put you in that exception, you should talk to a board-certified workers' compensation specialist because it can be a very important, complicated area. But generally, you can expect that your workers' compensation checks are going to be 2/3 of your average weekly wage, not dollar for dollar. Other thing to be mindful of is that there's a maximum cap on TTD, and it changes every year. So that means regardless of how much you make, your TTD is going to be capped if you're a higher wage earner. So this year, the max comp rate was 1,102. Last year, it was 1,066. And the max comp rate applicable to a given claim in the year is dependent on your year that you get hurt. So your date of injury might be 2020 might actually be 1066, and if you make $3,000 a week, you're going to be capped at that 1066 number, and it won't change. It'll always be that number. So that's the amount that you can expect on a weekly basis if you are completely unable to work. If a workers' comp doctor writes you completely out of work. What happens if you can go back to work? Well, if you can go back to work, and you aren't earning what you were earning before, you might be entitled to something called temporary partial disability. So that's TPD. You'll be entitled to it if you have an injury-related reason for earning less. So, for instance, let's say you have a back injury and you get work restrictions of no lifting more than 20 pounds, but your job requires you to lift 50 pounds. But you go back to work because your employer can accommodate those restrictions, you can't do everything that you were doing. And because you can't do everything you were doing, you're maybe earning half of what you were earning a week. Well, theoretically, you should be entitled to TPD. So for instance, let's say you were earning $600 before your injury, and then you earn $300 afterwards because you're earning less, because you can't do all of your job, then you could be entitled to TPD of $200 and a penny. That's because the difference between 600 and 300 is going to be multiplied by 0.6667 is going to be 200.1. So when it comes to TPD, many times employers do not maybe know to send the paycheck to the workers' comp carrier, or they just don't do it. So it's really important that you push that. You make sure that you're calling the carrier and showing them that you're earning less so that they issue the difference in the check. And you make sure, because sometimes they'll only send a check if somebody's being written completely out of work, when really somebody might be due something like TPD. So that's how much you are due. On to the second question, the question we get asked just as often. When are you due it? When are you due? First, you should be mindful of that there is a 7-day waiting period before disability compensation is even due, so before your checks are even due. When you have missed more than 7 days of work because of being restricted from all work by the workers' comp doctor, you are eligible to receive compensation for TDD. So after 7 days, you'll be paid at the end of that weekly period. So, right off the bat, you won't expect a check until 14 days after your initial out of work date. But after that, you should be expecting a check on a weekly basis. So for instance, if you have a check owed for the period covering January 1st until January 7th, you should expect that pay due date is at the end of the pay period. And I bring that up because that's actually oftentimes a confusing point for folks, as they think they should get a check at the beginning of the pay period, right on January 1st as opposed to January 7th. And what I tell folks is it's best to think of it in terms of like a paycheck. You don't get a check until the end of the pay period. And that's really important to keep in mind because the when it's legally late is dependent on when it's due. So that kind of delves into that third topic, which of course is when is it legally late and what can you do about it? And this is a huge issue for a lot of clients. They rely on consistent checks. I mean, we all do. We need those checks to come in to pay our mortgages, to pay our car payments, to pay bills. I mean, we just can't. We need to have a sense that things are going to be coming in on time. So a check is legally late 14 days from the date it's due, which is the end, as we just talked, which is the end of your check, of that pay period. So, be sure not to count 14 days from the beginning of the pay period. So if we use that prior example, if the check for, January 1st till January 7th is due on January 7th, then it's not legally late until 14 days from January 7th, which is January 21st. If no check, on that 14th day and it gets passed, it would be subject to something called a 10% penalty. That's important to know because you can file something with the North Carolina Industrial Commission. You can file a motion to compel that 10% penalty. If you haven't become familiar with the North Carolina Industrial Commission, they've got a website online. They are the state agency that oversees workers' compensation claims. They have some information on their website, but if you have a disagreement or if you feel like you should be owed a penalty, they are the state agency that you would go to for recourse. You would be filing a motion with them. As attorneys, board certified specialists, we go to them routinely whenever we do feel like we want to send a message to the insurance carrier that we're not going to just sit idly by when our clients' checks are consistently late. We're gonna push for that late penalty. So that's one option. If, for instance, you see a pattern from the insurance carrier and they are issuing the checks not when they're due, but before that 14-day late period, so before the 10% penalty might be imposed, you also have the option, or your attorney has the option, of filing something called a motion to compel timely payments. Because again, these checks are due on a weekly basis. They're not supposed to be coming every week and a half or every 2 weeks. People should have a sense that they can expect the check will come on a consistent basis so they can live. And the Industrial Commission understands that. So that's an option. Tip of the week, and this is a really important one. Keep track of your checks. It's not mandated by the Workers' Comp Act that the insurance carrier offer direct deposit. So for the most part, folks are getting their checks in the mail. And because of that, you can grab onto that check stub after you've gone ahead and deposit your check and put it in a shoebox somewhere, or put it in a filing cabinet if you want to. If you're really good, you can make a little chart or something on the computer that keeps track, but make sure you're keeping track of the pay periods and when they're coming. Sometimes you see a pattern. It comes up. It's very helpful when you are having a check that's late on a consistent basis, maybe not legally late, but late, or if you want to figure out which check you're missing, because sometimes people are not keeping track of it. It's helpful also, as attorneys representing claimants, we like to see it, because when I get a call from a client and they're asking me where their check is, the first thing I'm going to ask them is I'm going to say, well, what's the last check you received? What pay period did it cover? I use that information to figure out what's the next check that's due and whether or not that check is legally late. And that's also the kind of information that you as a claimant can use to talk to the adjuster about. You can say, listen, I know that my check covering this pay period was due. I know that because the last check I received was X. So I know that if it was due on this date at the end of the pay period, that you all are late. If you keep track of your pay stubs too, or you keep them safe and handy, you can also take a picture, email it over to the adjuster and say, here's a copy of my last check. It's good to have that in an email or in a fax, because you want to keep that paper trail. Sometimes you can't do that with a phone call or a voicemail, and that will help you and empower you. So, regardless of whether you choose to do it on your own or you choose to have an attorney help you, keeping your pay stubs is always a good idea. So that's all for now on today's episode. Join us next time. Bring your questions. This is Jennifer Signieri in Durham with Johnson & Groniger.